The top picture is Dmitry Nikolaevich Nabokov, the author's grandfather, 1827 to 1904, Minister of Justice, 1878 to 1885. The bottom picture is the author's paternal grandmother, Baroness Maria von Korff, 1842 to 1926, in the late 1850s. Four. The kind of Russian family to which I belonged, a kind now extinct, had among other virtues a traditional leaning toward the comfortable products of Anglo-Saxon civilization. Pear's soap, tar-black when dry, topaz-like when held to the light between wet fingers, took care of one's morning bath. Pleasant was the decreasing weight of the English collapsible tub when it made to protrude a rubber underlip and disgorge its frothy contents into the shop pail. We could not improve the cream, so we improved the tube, said the English toothpaste. At breakfast, golden syrup, imported from London, would twist with its glowing coils the revolving spoon, from which enough of it had slithered onto a piece of Russian bread and butter. All sorts of snug, mellow things came in a steady procession from the English shop on Nevsky Avenue. Fruit cakes, smelling salts, playing cards, picture puzzles, striped blazers, talcum white tennis balls. I learned to read English before I could read Russian. My first English friends were 4 simple souls in my grammar: Ben, Dan, Sam, and Ned. There used to be a great deal of fuss about their identities and whereabouts. Who is Ben? He is Dan. Sam is in bed, and so on. Although it all remained rather stiff and patchy, the compiler was handicapped by having to employ, for the initial lessons at least, words of not more than 3 letters. My imagination was somehow managed to obtain the necessary data. Wan-faced, big-limbed, silent nitwits, proud in the possession of certain tools. Ben has an axe. They now drift with a slow-motioned slouch across the remotest backdrop of memory, and akin to the mad alphabet of an optician's chart, the grammar book lettering looms again before me. The schoolroom was drenched with sunlight. In a sweating glass jar, several spiny caterpillars were feeding on nettle leaves and ejecting interesting barrel-shaped pellets of olive-green frost. The oilcloth that covered the round table smelled of glue. Miss Clayton smelled of Miss Clayton. Fantastically, gloriously, the blood-colored alcohol of the outside thermometer had risen to 24 Reaumur, 86 Fahrenheit, in the shade. Through the window one could see kerchiefed peasant girls weeding a garden path on their hands and knees or gently raking the sun-mottled sand. The happy days when they would be cleaning streets and digging canals for state were still beyond the horizon. Golden orioles in the greenery emitted their 4 brilliant notes. Dee-dee-dee-o. Ned lumbered past the window in a fair impersonation of the gardener's mate Ivan, who was to become in 1918 a member of the local Soviet. On later pages, longer words appeared, and at the very end of the brown ink-stained volume, a real sensible story unfolded its adult sentences. One day, Ted said to Anne, "Let us," the little reader's ultimate triumph and reward. I was thrilled by the thought that someday I might attain such proficiency. The magic has endured, and whenever a grammar book comes my way, I instantly turn to the last page to enjoy a forbidden glimpse at the laborious student's future, of that promised land where at last words are meant to mean what they mean. Summer, sumerki, the lovely Russian word for dusk. Time, a dim point in the first decade of this unpopular century. Place, latitude 59 degrees north from your equator, longitude 100 degrees east from my writing hand. The day would take hours to fade, and everything, sky, tall flowers, still water, would be kept in a state of infinite vesperal suspense. deepened rather than resolved, by the doleful moo of a cow in a distant meadow, or by the still more moving cry that came from some bird beyond the lower course of the river, where the vast expanse of a misty blue sphagnum bog, because of its mystery and remoteness, and Rukavishnikov children have baptized America. In the drawing-room of our country house before going to bed, I would often be read to in English by my mother. As she came to a particularly dramatic passage where the hero was about to encounter some strange, perhaps fatal danger, her voice would slow down, her words would be spaced portentously, and before turning the page she would place upon it her hand, with its familiar pigeon-blood ruby and diamond ring within the limpid facets of which, had I been a better crystal gazer, I might have seen a room, people, lights, trees in the rain, a whole period of immigrant life for which that ring was to play. There were tales about knights whose terrific but wonderfully ascetic wounds were bathed by damsels in grottos. From a wind-swept cliff-top, a medieval maiden with flying hair and a youth in hose gazed at the round aisles of the blessed, and misunderstood the fate of Humphrey, used to bring a more specialized lump to one's throat than anything in Dickens or Daudet, great devisers of lumps, while a shamelessly allegorical story, Beyond the Blue Mountains, dealing with two pairs of little travelers, Good Clover and Cowslip, Bad Buttercup and Daisy, contained enough exciting details to make one forget its message. There were also those large, flat, glossy picture books. I particularly liked the blue-coated, red-trousered, coal-black Gollywog, with underclothes, buttons for eyes, and his meager harem of 5 wooden dolls, by the illegal method of cutting themselves frocks out of the American flag, Peg taking the motherly stripes, Sarah Jane the pretty stars. 2 of the dolls acquired a certain soft femininity, once their neutral articulations had been clothed. The twins, Mag and Weg, and the midget, remained stark naked and consequently sexless. We see them in the dead of night stealing out of the doors to sling snowballs at one another until the chimes of a remote clock. But hark, comments the rhymed text. Send them back to their toy box in the nursery. A rude jack-in-the-box shoots out frightening my lovely Sarah, and that picture I heartily disliked because it reminded me of children's parties at which this or that graceful little girl who had bewitched me happened to pinch her finger or hurt her knee, and would forthwith expand into a purple-faced goblin, all wrinkles and bawling mouth. Another time they went on a bicycle journey and were captured by cannibals. Our unsuspecting travelers had been quenching their thirst at a palm-fringed pool when the tom-tom sounded. Over the shoulder of my past I admire again the crucial picture, Gollywog, still on his knees by the pool but no longer drinking, his hair strands on end, and the normal black of his face has changed to a weird ashen hue. There was also the motor car book, Sarah Jane, always my favorite, sporting a long green veil, with the usual sequel, crutches and bandaged heads. And yes, the airship, yards and yards of yellow silk went to make it. An additional tiny balloon was provided for the sole use of the fortunate midget. At the immense altitude to which the ship reached, the aeronauts huddled together for warmth, while the lost little soloist, still the object of my intense envy notwithstanding his plight, drifted into an abyss of frost and stars alone. I next see my mother leading me bedward through the enormous hall where a central flight of stairs swept up and up, with nothing but hothouse-like panes of glass between the upper landing and the light green of the evening sky. One would lag back and shuffle and slide a little on the smooth stone floor of the hall, causing the gentle hand at the small of one's back to propel one's reluctant frame by means of indulgent pushes. Upon reaching the stairway, my custom was to get to the steps by squirming under the handrail between the newel post and the first banister. With every new summer, the process of squeezing through became more difficult. Nowadays, even my ghost would get stuck. Another part of the ritual was to ascend with closed eyes. Step, 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 came my mother's voice as she led me out, and sure enough the surface of the next tread would receive the blind child's confident foot. All one had to do was lift it a little higher than usual so as to avoid stubbing one's toe against the riser. This slow, somewhat somnambulistic ascension from the self-engendered darkness held obvious delights. The keenest of them was not knowing when the last step would come. At the top of the stairs, one's foot would be automatically lifted to the deceptive call of step, and then with a momentary sense of exquisite panic, with a wild contraction of muscles, would sink into the phantasm of a step, padded as it were with the infinitely elastic stuff of its own non-existence. It is surprising what method there was in my bedtime dawdling. True, the whole going up the stairs business now reveals certain transcendental values. Actually, however, I was merely playing for time by extending every second to its utmost. This would still go on when my mother turned me over to be undressed to Miss Clayton or Mademoiselle. There were 5 bathrooms in our country house, and a medley of venerable washstands, one of those I would seek out in the dark whenever I had been crying, so as to feel on my swollen face, which I was ashamed to show, the healing touch of its groping jet, while I stepped on the rusty pedal. Regular baths were taken in the evening. For morning ablutions, the round rubber English tubs were used. Mine was about 4 feet in diameter, with a knee-high rim. Upon the lathered back of the squatting child, a jug full of water was carefully poured by an aproned servant. Its temperature varied with the hydrotherapeutic notions of successive mentors. There was that bleak period of dawning puberty, when an icy deluge was decreed by our current tutor, who happened to be a medical student. On the other hand, temperature of one's evening bath remained pleasantly constant at 28 degrees Reaumur, 95 degrees Fahrenheit, as measured by a large kindly thermometer whose wooden sheathing, with a bit of damp string in the eye of the handle, allowed it to share in the buoyancy of celluloid goldfishes and little swans. The toilets were separate from the bathrooms, and the oldest among them is a rather sumptuous but gloomy affair, with some fine panelwork and tasseled rope of red velvet, which when pulled produced a beautifully modulated, discreetly muffled gurgle and gulp. From that corner of the house one could see Hesperus and hear the nightingales, and it was there that later I used to compose my youthful verse, dedicated to unembraced beauties, and morosely survey, in a dimly illuminated mirror, the immediate erection of a strange castle in an unknown Spain. As a small child, however, I was assigned a more modest arrangement, rather casually situated in a narrow recess between a wicker hamper and the door leading to a nursery bathroom. This door I liked to keep ajar, though I drowsily looked at the shimmer of steam above the mahogany bath, at the fantastic flotilla of swans and skiffs, at myself with a harp in one of the boats, at a furry moth pinging against the reflector of the kerosene lamp, at the stained glass window beyond, at its 2 halberdiers, consisting of colored rectangles, bending from my warm seat. I liked to press the middle of my brow, its Ophirin, to be precise, against the smooth, comfortable edge of the door, and then roll my head a little, so that the door would move to and fro while its edge remained all the time in soothing contact with my forehead. A dreamy rhythm would permeate my being. The recent step, step, step would be taken up by a dripping faucet, and fruitfully combining rhythmic pattern with rhythmic sound, I would unravel the labyrinthian frets on the linoleum and find faces where a crack or a shadow afforded a point de repere for the eye. I appeal to parents, never, never say hurry up to a child. The final stage in the course of my vague navigation would come when I reached the island of my bed. From the veranda or drawing room, where life was going on without me, my mother would come up for the warm murmur of her good-night kiss. Closed inside shutters, a lighted candle. Gentle Jesus, meek and mild, something, something, little child. The child kneeling on the pillow that presently would engulf his humming head. English prayers and the little icon featuring a sun-tanned Greek Catholic saint formed an innocent association upon which I looked back with pleasure, and above the icon, high up on the wall, where the shadow of something of the bamboo screen between the bed and door undulated in the warm candlelight, a framed aquarelle shed a dusky path winding through one of those eerily dense European beech woods, where the only undergrowth is bindweed and the only sound of one's thumping heart. In an English fairy tale my mother had once read to me, a small boy stepped out of his bed into a picture and rode his hobby horse along a painted path between silent trees, while I knelt on my pillow in a mist of drowsiness and talc-powdered well-being, half sitting on my calves and rapidly going through my prayer. I imagined the motion of climbing into the picture, above my bed, and plunging into that enchanted beech wood, which I did visit in due time. A bewildering sequence of English nurses and governesses, some of them wringing their hands, others smiling at me enigmatically, come out to meet me as I re-enter my past. There is a dim Miss Rachel, whom I remember mainly in terms of Huntley and Palmer biscuits, the nice almond rocks at the top of the blue-papered tin box, the insipid crackerels at the bottom, cracknels at the bottom, which she unlawfully shared with me after my teeth had been brushed. There was Miss Clayton, who, when I slumped in my chair, would poke me in the middle vertebrae, and then smilingly throw back her own shoulders to show what she wanted of me. She told me a nephew of hers at my age, 4, used to breed caterpillars, but those she collected for me in an open jar with nettles all walked away one morning, and the gardener said they had hanged themselves. There was lovely black-haired, aquamarine-eyed Miss Norcott, who lost a white kid glove at Nice or Beaulieu, where I vainly looked for it on the shingly beach, among the colored pebbles and the glaucous lamps of sea-changed bottle glass. Lovely Miss Norcott was asked to leave at once one night at Abbazia. She embraced me in the morning twilight of the nursery, pale mackintoshed and weeping like a baby, weeping like a Babylonian willow, and that day I remained inconsolable despite the hot chocolate that the Petersons' old nanny had made, especially for me, in the special bread and butter, on the smooth surface of which my Aunt Nada, adroitly capturing my attention, drew a daisy, then a cat, and then the little mermaid whom I had just been reading about with Miss Norcott, and crying over too, so I started to cry again. There was myopic little Miss Hunt, whose short stay with us in Wiesbaden came to an end the day my brother and I, aged 4 and 5 respectively, managed to evade her nervous vigilance by boarding a steamer that took us quite a way down the Rhine before recapture. There was pink-nosed Miss Robinson. There was Miss Clayton again. There was one awful person who read to me Marie Corelli's The Mighty Atom. There were still others. At a certain point, they faded out of my life. French and Russian took over, and what little time remained for the speaking of English was devoted to occasional sessions with 2 gentlemen, Mr. Burness and Mr. Cummings, neither of whom dwelt with us. They are associated in my mind with Winters in St. Petersburg, where we had a house on the Morskaya Street. Mr. Burness was a large Scotsman with a florid face, light blue eyes, and lank straw-colored hair. He spent his mornings teaching at a language school, and then crammed into the afternoon more private lessons than the day could well hold, traveling as he did from one part of the town to another, and having to depend on the torpid trot of dejected izvoshchik cab horses to get him to his pupils. He would be, with luck, only a quarter of an hour late for his 2 o'clock lesson, wherever that was, but would arrive after 5 for his 4 o'clock one. The tension of waiting for him and hoping that for once his superhuman doggedness might balk before the gray wall of some special snowstorm was the kind of feeling that one trusts never to meet with in mature life, but that I did experience again when circumstances forced me, in my turn, to give lessons, and when in my furnished rooms in Berlin I awaited a certain stone-faced pupil who would always turn up despite the obstacles I mentally piled in his way. The very darkness that was gathering outside seemed a waste product of Mr. Burness's efforts to reach our house. Presently the valet would come, drop the blue voluminous blinds, and draw the flowered window draperies. The tick-tock of grandfather's clock in the schoolroom gradually assumed a dreary, nagging intonation. The tightness of my shorts in the groin, and the rough touch of ribbed black stockings rubbing against the tender inside of my bent legs, would mingle with the dull pressure of a humble need, the satisfaction of which I kept postponing. Nearly an hour would pass, and there would be no sign of Mr. Burness. My brother would go to his room and play some practice piece on the piano, and then plunge and replunge into some of the melodies that I loathed, the Institution to the Artificial Flowers, and Faust, Dites Louis quel est belle, or Vladimir Linsky's wail, Kuda, 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 vi udalilis. I would leave the upper floor where we children dwelt, and slowly slide along the balustrade down to the second story where my parents' rooms were situated. As often as not, they used to be out at that time, and in the gathering dusk the place acted upon my young senses in a curiously teleological way, as if this accumulation of familiar things in the dark were doing its utmost to form the definite and permanent image that repeated exposure did finally leave in my mind. The sepia gloom of an Arctic afternoon in midwinter invaded the rooms and was deepening to an oppressive black. A bronze angle, a surface of glass or polished mahogany here and there in the darkness, reflected the odds and ends of light from the street, where the globes of tall street lamps along its middle line were already diffusing their lunar glow. Gauzy shadows moved on the ceiling. In the stillness, the dry sound of the chrysanthemum petal falling upon the marble of a table made one's nerves twang. My mother's boudoir had a convenient oriel for looking out on the Morskaya in the direction of the Maria Square. With lips pressed against the thin fabric that veiled the window pane, I would gradually taste the cold of the glass through the gauze. From that oriel, some years later, at the outbreak of the Revolution, I watched various engagements and saw my first dead man, who was being carried away on a stretcher, and from one dangling leg, an ill-shod comrade kept trying to pull off the boot despite pushes and punches from the stretcherman, all this at a goodish trot. But in the days of Mr. Burness's lessons there was nothing to watch save the dark muffled street and its receding line of loftily suspended lamps, around which the snowflakes passed and repassed with a graceful, almost deliberately slackened motion, as if to show how the trick was done and how simple it was. From another angle one might see a more generous stream of snow in a brighter, violet-tinged nimbus of gaslight, and then the jutting enclosure where I stood would seem to drift slowly up and up like a balloon. At last one of the phantom sleighs, gliding along the street, would come to a stop, and with a gawky haste Mr. Burness and his fox-furred shapka would make for our door. From the schoolroom, whither I preceded him, I would hear his vigorous footsteps crashing nearer and nearer, and no matter how cold the day was, his good ruddy face would be sweating abundantly as he strode in. I remember the terrific energy with which he pressed on the spluttering pen as he wrote down in the roundest of round hands the tasks to be prepared for the next day. Usually at the end of the lesson a certain limerick was asked for and granted, the point of the performance being the word screamed in it was to be involuntarily enacted by oneself every time Mr. Burness gave a formidable squeeze to the hand he held in his beefy paw as he recited the lines. There was a young lady from Russia who squeeze whenever you'd crush her. She squeeze, and she squeeze, by which time the pain would have become so excruciating that we never got any further. The quiet, bearded gentleman with stoop, old-fashioned Mr. Cummings, who taught me in 1907 or 1908 to draw, had been my mother's drawing master also. He had come to Russia in the early 90s as a foreign correspondent and illustrated for the London Graphic. Marital misfortunes were rumored to obscure his life. A melancholy sweetness of manner made up for the meagreness of his talent. He wore an ulster unless the weather was very mild, and when he would switch to the kind of greenish-brown woolen cloak called a loden, I was captivated by his use of the special eraser he kept in his waistcoat pocket, by the manner in which he held the page taut and afterward flicked off with the black of his fingers the guticles of the percha, as he said. Silently, sadly, he illustrated for me the marble laws of perspective. Long, straight strokes of his elegantly held, incredibly sharp pencil caused the lines of his room he created out of nothing, abstract walls, receding ceiling and floor, to come together in one remote hypothetical point with tantalizing and sterile accuracy. Tantalizing because it made me think of railway tracks, symmetrically and trickily converging before the bloodshot eyes of my favorite mask, a grimy engine driver. Sterile because that room remained unfurnished and quite empty, being devoid even of the neutral statues one finds in the uninteresting first hall of a museum. The rest of the picture gallery made up for its gaunt vestibule. Mr. Cummings was a master of the sunset. His little watercolors, purchased at different times for 5 or 10 rubles apiece, by members of our household, led a somewhat precarious existence, shifting as they did to a more and more obscure nooks, and finally getting completely eclipsed by some sleek porcelain beast or a newly framed photograph. After I had learned not only to draw cubes and cones, but to shade properly with smooth, merging slants such parts of them as had to be made to turn away forever, the kind old gentleman contented himself with painting under my enchanted gaze his own wet little paradises, variations of one landscape, a summer evening with an orange sky, a pasture ending in the black fringe of a distant forest, and a luminous river repeating the sky and winding away and away. Later on, from around 1910 to 1912, the well-known Impressionist, a term of the period, Yermik took over. A humorless and formless person, he advocated a bold style, blotches of dull color, smears of sepia and olive brown, by means of which I had to reproduce on huge sheets of gray paper humanoid shapes that we modeled of plasticine and placed in dramatic positions against a backcloth of velvet with all kinds of folds and shadow effects. It was a depressing combination of at least 3 different arts, all approximative. And finally, I rebelled. He was replaced by the celebrated Dobozhinsky, who liked to give me his lessons on the piano nobile of our house, in one of its pretty reception rooms downstairs, which he entered in a particularly noiseless way, as if afraid to startle me from my verse-making stupor. He made me depict from memory, in the greatest possible detail, objects I had certainly seen thousands of times without visualizing them properly. A street lamp, a post box, a tulip design on the stained glass of our own front door. He tried to teach me to find the geometrical coordinations between the slender twigs of a leafless boulevard tree, a system of visual give and takes requiring a precision of linear expression, which I failed to achieve in my youth but applied gratefully in my adult instar, not only to the drawing of butterfly genitalia during my 7 years at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology, but immersing myself in the bright well-hole of a microscope to record in India ink this or that new structure, but also perhaps to certain camera lucida needs of literary composition. Emotionally, however, I am still more indebted to the earlier color treats given me by my mother and her former teacher. How readily Mr. Cummings would sit down on a stool, part behind with both hands. His what? Was he wearing a frock coat? I see only the gesture, and proceeded to open the black tin paint box. I loved the nimble way he had of soaking his paintbrush in multiple color to accompaniment of a rapid clatter produced by the enamel containers, wherein the rich reds and yellows that the brush dimpled were appetizingly cupped, and having thus collected its honey, it would cease to hover and poke, and by 2 or 3 sweeps of its lush tip would drench the Vatmansky paper with an even spread of orange sky, across which, while that sky was still dampish, a long purple-black cloud would be laid. And that's all, dearie, he would say. That's all there is to it. On one occasion I had him draw an express train for me, and I watched his pencil ably evolve the cow-catcher and elaborate headlights of a locomotive that looked as if it had been acquired second-hand for the Trans-Siberian line after it had done its duty at Promontory Point, Utah, in the 60s. Then came 5 disappointingly plain carriages. When he had quite finished them, he carefully shaded the ample smoke coming from the huge funnel, cocked the head, and after a moment of pleased contemplation, handed me the drawing. I tried to look pleased, too. He had forgotten the tinder. A quarter of a century later I learned 2 things: that Burness, by then dead, had been well known in Edinburgh as a scholarly translator of the Russian romantic poems that had been the altar and frenzy of my boyhood, and that my humble drawing master, whose age I used to synchronize with that of old granduncles and old family servants, had married a young Estonian girl about the time I myself married. When I learned these later developments, I experienced a queer shock. It was as if life had impinged upon my creative rights by wriggling on beyond the subjective limits so elegantly and economically set by childhood memories that I thought I had signed and sealed. "And what about Yeremich?" I asked M.V. Dobozhinsky one summer afternoon in the 1940s as we strolled through a beech forest in Vermont. "Is he remembered?" "Indeed he is," replied Stislav Valerianovich. He was exceptionally gifted. I don't know what kind of teacher he was, but I do know that you were the most hopeless pupil I ever had.